The Brooklyn night market was a river of light and noise, flowing through the heart of the city like a pulse that refused to quiet. Neon signs buzzed overhead, flickering in blues and pinks that reflected in puddles still damp from an afternoon shower. Strings of bulbs were strung like constellations across the aisles, glowing warmly against the darkness. Music throbbed from every corner. Latin beats from a food truck speakers, a saxophonist weaving smooth notes into the air, the rhythmic clatter of spatulas hitting hot griddles. The scents were dizzying, roasted corn charred at the edges, cinnamon sugar sprinkled thick over churros, garlic sizzling in oil, coffee brewed strong enough to slice through the night air. Families strolled with wide-eyed children, couples held hands, teenagers darted between stalls with fried dumplings on skewers. The crowd surged in constant motion, a tide of faces and voices that made the market feel alive, chaotic, endless. And at the very entrance, tucked just under the towering arch painted with Brooklyn Night Market in looping letters, sat the ticket booth. It was a small cube of glass and metal, barely wide enough for a chair, a drawer for cash, and the narrow counter where money passed in and wristbands passed out. For most, it was an afterthought, just one more obstacle between them and the glittering maze of food and stalls. Behind the glass sat Evelyn Carter. At 58, Evelyn blended easily into the background. Her uniform, a polo shirt faded by too many wash cycles, hung neatly on her shoulders. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled into a bun at the nape of her neck, tidy and unremarkable. She wore no makeup. Her skin carried the soft lines of a woman who had lived and worked and endured. To the steady stream of customers, she was the ticket lady, a fixture like the string lights above or the barricades guiding the line. But her eyes, gray and sharp as cut steel, were never careless. Money slid across her counter in bills of 10s and 20s, sometimes 50s, rarely hundreds. Her fingers moved with deliberate precision, smoothing each note, stacking them square, returning change exact to the cent. She worked with quiet efficiency, never rushing, never fumbling. Those who watched closely might have noticed how she double-checked the numbers, how she tracked every movement with the concentration of someone who could not afford mistakes. But few watched closely. Most barely saw her at all. Until that night. Hey, that's not right. Evelyn's voice rang out, slicing clean through the chatter of the crowd. Heads turned. A group of teenagers fell silent mid-laugh. A father carrying his daughter shifted, frowning. The noodle vendor 3 stalls down paused mid-stir. At the counter stood a young man, maybe 22, his hair slicked back with too much gel. He wore a dark jacket, clean and stylish, his stance too confident for the line he'd just stood in. His hand hovered awkwardly near his sleeve, where, just seconds earlier, he had tried to slide an extra 20 into hiding. His smirk, the practiced grin of someone who thought he could charm his way through anything, faltered under Evelyn's unblinking stare. "What are you talking about, lady?" he said, his voice pitched louder than necessary, designed for the audience now gathering. He tried for incredulity, for the swagger of an innocent man wronged. Evelyn's tone was steady, every syllable deliberate. "You gave me a 50. 2 tickets cost you 20. I handed you 30 back. And now you're slipping another 20 into your sleeve like it belongs to you." A ripple moved through the line. People leaned closer, craning their necks. Some exchanged curious glances, others whispered. The teenagers widened their eyes, already sensing entertainment. The young man laughed, a hollow sound that cracked at the edges. 100, he said quickly. "I gave you 100. You shorted me." He turned to the crowd, his voice louder now, trying to pull them into his performance. "You all saw it, right? I gave her a $100 bill, and now she's accusing me of stealing. She can't even count." Murmurs spread like sparks through dry grass. "Maybe he's right," someone muttered. A woman frowned, suspicious. The crowd teetered, unsure which way to lean. But Evelyn did not flinch. Her gaze locked on him, cool and piercing. She leaned slightly forward, her voice dropping into something quieter but sharper, a blade drawn slow. "Do you think I can't tell the difference between a 50 and 100? The young man hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough. "I was counting bills before you knew how to tie your shoes," Evelyn continued. "I can spot a fake invoice from across the room. I can add a column of numbers in my head faster than you can type them into your phone. And I can smell a lie farther away than that food stall over there." She pointed without looking at the noodle vendor, steam curling around his wide-eyed face. The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers. The teenagers chorused, "Oh," like spectators at a schoolyard showdown. The young man's cheeks flushed. "Lady, you're crazy," he muttered, though his voice wavered now. Evelyn slammed her palm onto the counter. The sound cracked like a gunshot. "Empty your sleeve." The words landed heavy, undeniable. The crowd fell silent, their breath caught. The young man froze. His eyes darted left, right, searching for an escape. But the line of people had closed in tight, forming a circle of witnesses. He was trapped. Finally, with exaggerated reluctance, he tugged at his sleeve. A crumpled 20 slipped free, fluttering onto the counter like a guilty bird. The gasp that rippled through the crowd was almost theatrical. A man whistled low. Children clapped their sticky hands together. The teenagers roared with laughter. The young man stammered. That must have been there from before. I didn't. No." Evelyn's voice was sharp, final. "That was mine. That was the market's." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then a single clap rang out. A man in a Yankees cap began, slow and deliberate. Another joint. And another. Within seconds, applause swelled, rising into cheers and whistles. The noodle vendor banged his ladle against his wok like a drum. The young man's face burned red. He bolted, vanishing into the throng, swallowed by neon light and noise. Evelyn didn't chase him. She didn't raise her voice again. She adjusted her glasses, smoothed the bills into neat stacks, and returned the 20 to the drawer. Her face was calm, but inside her chest, her heart raced, not with fear, but with something sharper, older, long dormant. For the first time in years, she felt alive. The applause faded, but the whispers lingered. Customers approached her booth with cautious admiration now. "Good for you," a woman murmured as she collected her tickets. A man leaned in, his tone conspiratorial. "You've got sharp eyes." Evelyn gave them polite nods, nothing more. She wasn't here for thanks. She was here because she couldn't ignore what she had seen. The line moved on, business resumed, but her mind refused to quiet. The young man's trick had been too smooth, too practiced. That wasn't clumsy theft, it was routine, which meant he wasn't the only one. Her instincts stirred, old muscles stretching. Years ago, she had sat in glass towers above Manhattan, dissecting numbers that didn't add up, catching fraud hidden behind polished facades. She had been Evelyn Carter, chief accountant of Silverman and Company, the woman who could sniff out dishonesty buried in spreadsheets. They had pushed her out, silenced her, left her invisible. But invisibility had never meant blindness. By the time midnight came and the market dimmed, Evelyn had already decided. She walked home through Brooklyn's quieter streets, the canvas bag with the day's receipts heavy in her hand. The city sounds shifted in the late hour. Cars hissed along wet asphalt. A siren wailed in the distance. Footsteps echoed sharp in alleys. She kept her shoulders straight, her pace steady. In her apartment above the laundromat, she poured water into a chipped glass, sat at her small table, and spread the receipts under the lamp. To most, they were scraps. To her, they were a map. Patterns emerged. Duplicate timestamps. Totals that didn't match the drawer count. Handwriting that wavered from one slip to the next. And then, scrawled more than once, a name that did not belong. Benson Logistics. Her pulse quickened. She knew the shape of this game. A shell company. A funnel. A trick to siphon money while no one looked. Evelyn leaned back, staring at the paper like it was a crime scene. 15 years ago, she had sounded the alarm on fraud that reached into millions. They hadn't listened then. They had silenced her instead. But this time would be different. As she gathered the papers, a sound jolted her. A car door slammed outside. She moved to the window, pulling the curtain just an inch. Across the street, a dark sedan sat idling. Two silhouettes inside. One lit a cigarette, the ember glowing red in the shadows. Evelyn's breath caught. They weren't neighbors. They weren't lost. They were watching. The sedan lingered outside her window longer than it should have. Evelyn stood in the dim light of her apartment, her fingers gripping the curtain so tightly that the fabric bit into her skin. Through the narrow slit, she could see the glow of a cigarette tip flaring and dimming, a rhythmic pulse in the shadows. The car's engine hummed low, steady, patient. She counted the minutes by the throb of her own heartbeat. 5, 10, 15. Only after what felt like an eternity did the sedan roll away, its taillights retreating until the street was swallowed again by darkness. Evelyn let the curtain fall. She stood motionless for a long time, listening to the faint rattle of the pipes in the walls, the hum of the laundromat below, the restless thrum of the city beyond. Her apartment felt too small, too fragile, as if the walls themselves had ears. She returned to the table where the night's receipts lay scattered. The lamp cast a hard glow across the slips of paper, throwing their shadows long and sharp. To anyone else they were meaningless scraps, but to Evelyn, they whispered secrets. She picked up her pen, her hand trembling slightly, and began writing down what she saw. Duplicate timestamps. Totals that did not add up. Stubs with handwriting that changed mid-page. And the same name, again and again, scrawled like a watermark across the mess. Benson Logistics. Her pen circled the words, dark ink pressing deep into the paper. This was no mistake. This was design. For years she had promised herself she was finished with this world. The endless scrutiny of numbers. The sleepless nights chasing inconsistencies. The paranoia of knowing every irregularity had teeth behind it. When she had left Silverman and Company, she had vowed she would trade skyscrapers and ledgers for something quiet, something no one would notice. Selling tickets at the night market had been safe, predictable, invisible. But that night in the booth had torn open the cocoon. The young man's practiced trick, the crowd's gasps, the $20 bill fluttering onto the counter. It had shaken something loose inside her. A memory, a muscle long dormant, a fire she had thought was extinguished. Numbers didn't lie. People did. And the numbers in front of her were screaming. Her phone buzzed on the counter, startling her. She glanced at the screen. A message from her daughter. Hey Mom, just checking in. How was work? Evelyn stared at the text. She imagined her daughter sitting miles away in a bright apartment, maybe with a glass of wine, maybe with the TV humming in the background, unaware of the weight pressing on her mother tonight. Evelyn typed slowly. Busy night. Everything's fine. How are you? A pause, then the reply. Good. Talk this weekend. Love you. Evelyn's thumb hovered over the keyboard, wanting to type more, to confess the tension that wrapped around her like wire. But she set the phone down instead. Her daughter had her own life, her own battles. Evelyn would not drag her into this. Not yet. She gathered the receipts into neat piles, clipped them together, and slid them back into the canvas bag. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would take them to the market office. Someone there would listen. They had to. Sleep, however, did not come easily. When it did, it came in fragments, fractured by dreams of paper trails twisting into endless corridors, numbers rearranging themselves just as she reached for them, shadows watching from across crowded rooms. She woke with her heart racing, the ghost of cigarette smoke lingering in her mind. By morning, her decision was firm. She would not be silenced. The market was alive again by the time she arrived, its vendors bustling to unload supplies, their voices rising cheerfully against the clang of metal tables. The air already smelled of frying oil and coffee, the promise of another long night settling over the lot. Evelyn went straight past her booth and into the small administrative office at the far end of the entrance. Inside, behind a desk cluttered with paper cups and crumpled receipts, sat a young man scrolling on his phone. His name tag read Kyle, Assistant Coordinator. He looked up as she entered, raising his eyebrows. Morning, Ms. Carter, he said, half distracted. I need to report irregularities, Evelyn said, setting the clipped receipts on the desk with a thud. Kyle blinked at the stack. Okay. Like what? Duplicate timestamps, Evelyn said crisply. Drawer totals that don't match. Stubs with handwriting that shifts halfway through. And this. She tapped the top receipt. Benson Logistics. This name shows up repeatedly. It doesn't belong here. Kyle leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. Miss Carter, with all due respect, this is a night market, not a bank. Vendors mess up paperwork all the time. It's messy. It's nothing. These aren't mistakes, Evelyn said sharply. They're deliberate. Someone is siphoning money out of this market. He let out a sigh, rubbing his temple. Even if you're right, and I'm not saying you are, it's not your job to worry about it. You sell tickets. Let us handle the books. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. And will you? Kyle avoided her gaze, reaching for his phone again. I've got bigger problems to deal with. Evelyn gathered the receipts back into her bag. Then I'll deal with this myself. He shrugged, already scrolling again. Suit yourself. Her jaw tightened as she left. The dismissal stung, but not because she wasn't used to it. She had seen that look before, polite indifference, the careful mask of someone who didn't want to see what was right in front of them. That evening, as she sat in her booth, the memory of that conversation burned in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that Kyle wasn't just careless. He was complicit. The crowd ebbed and flowed in front of her, the routine of wristbands and bills steadying her hands, but not her mind. She kept glancing past the glass, scanning the sea of faces. And then she saw him, the man in the leather jacket. He leaned casually against a lamppost, his posture relaxed, but his gaze fixed on her booth. He didn't move, didn't smile, didn't even pretend to be interested in the food stalls. He just watched. Their eyes met. A chill slid down Evelyn's spine. He smirked faintly, a knife-edge curve of his lips, and held her gaze for a long, deliberate moment. Her fingers froze on the wristband she was about to hand over. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to keep moving, to complete the transaction as though nothing was wrong. By the time she dared to look up again, the man was gone, swallowed by the crowd. That night, her walk home felt longer than usual. Every shuffle of footsteps behind her made her turn. Every shadow stretched too long. But she reached her apartment without incident, locked the door twice, and sat heavily at her table. She opened one of her old notebooks, one she hadn't touched since Silverman and Company. The first page bore her own handwriting, neat and firm. Rule number 1. Always follow the money. She almost laughed at the bitter irony. But instead, she picked up her pen and began copying the suspicious receipts into the notebook, line by line, connecting dots, circling names. Hours passed. The clock ticked past 2 in the morning. Her eyelids burned with exhaustion, but her hand refused to stop. Each line written was another thread woven into the web she was building. She paused only when a sudden knock rattled her door. Her heart stuttered. No one knocked at this hour. The knock came again, louder this time. She stood, her feet heavy, and crept toward the door. Pressing her eye to the peephole, she saw nothing. The hallway was empty. Slowly, cautiously, she unlatched the lock and opened the door a crack. No one stood there. But when she looked down, her stomach clenched. An envelope lay on the floor. It was thick, sealed with tape, no name or return address. Evelyn picked it up with trembling fingers, carried it inside, and sat at her desk before opening it. Inside were 3 items. A single $20 bill, a photograph of her, taken from the crowd, sitting at her booth, and a note, written in block letters. Keep quiet. Evelyn sat back, the envelope limp in her hands, the words burning into her vision. For a long moment, fear pinned her in place. They knew. They were watching. But as the fear settled heavy in her stomach, another feeling rose to meet it. Anger. They thought she was just a tired old woman in a booth. They thought a photo and a $20 bill would scare her away. They thought she would fold. But Evelyn Carter had spent a lifetime following liars through their footprints. And numbers, unlike people, never lied. She placed the note carefully into her notebook, circled the words "keep quiet," and beneath them, in sharp, deliberate letters, she wrote one word. No. Evelyn barely slept after the envelope arrived. She had placed it in the drawer of her desk, but she could still feel its weight pressing against her as she lay in bed. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the photograph of herself behind the booth, the gray outline of her hair under the harsh lights of the market. The words "keep quiet" scrawled across cheap paper like a commandment. When sleep did come, it was fractured, broken into uneasy fragments. In her dreams, she walked through endless hallways of filing cabinets, each drawer sliding open to reveal not paper, but eyes staring at her. She reached for numbers that shifted before she could hold them. Voices whispered, and every whisper ended with the same words. Keep quiet. Keep quiet. She woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, her breath ragged. The city was still gray and hushed outside her window. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, staring at the floor, before finally forcing herself up. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's coffee grounds. She brewed a fresh pot, the bitterness filling the air, grounding her. She needed that bitterness. It was honest, predictable, unlike people. She sat at her small table, notebook open, pen in hand, and stared at the words she had written before bed. No, just 3 letters, but they anchored her. They reminded her that she had been here before, in different ways, in different places. She had stood in boardrooms where men with expensive suits and colder eyes had tried to silence her. She had been dismissed as paranoid, as difficult, as replaceable, and yet she had always been right. The ghosts of her past stirred, uninvited. 15 years ago, Evelyn Carter had been a name that mattered. Chief accountant of Silverman and Company, one of Manhattan's most prestigious firms. She had the corner office on the 28th floor, a view of the skyline that glittered at night. She had a team of junior accountants who looked up to her, who leaned on her to catch their mistakes and teach them how to see what wasn't obvious. She had built her career on diligence, on the unshakable belief that truth lived in numbers even when people tried to bury it. She remembered the smell of that office, polished wood, stale coffee, the faint tang of printer ink. She remembered the way her heels clicked across the marble lobby each morning, how the receptionist would greet her by name. She remembered the pride in her daughter's eyes when she once visited, a little girl clutching Evelyn's hand as they walked past the glass doors. And she remembered the day it all fell apart. It had started the way it always did, with numbers that didn't add up. A vendor called Orwell Consulting, charging exorbitant fees for vague, strategic assessments. The invoices looked ordinary at first glance, but Evelyn's eyes caught the patterns no one else saw. Dates too perfect, amounts that rounded in suspicious ways, signatures that didn't match. She had dug deeper, following the paper trail through subsidiary accounts and offshore transactions. Weeks of sleepless nights spent cross-referencing files, scanning spreadsheets until the numbers blurred. Finally, she had uncovered the truth. Orwell Consulting was a shell. Money was being funneled out of the company in steady, deliberate streams. $6 million a year. She had gone to the executives, armed with charts and binders, certain they would thank her for catching it in time. She could still hear her own voice in that conference room, calm and unwavering as she laid out her findings. Silverman and Company is bleeding money, she had said, her finger tapping the figures projected on the wall. These invoices are fake. The supplier doesn't exist. Payments are being rerouted through a holding company in the Caymans. It's embezzlement. The room had gone silent. She remembered the CEO's expression, not shock, not gratitude, but something colder. Fear. Annoyance. Are you sure, Evelyn? He had asked, his tone flat. The math doesn't lie, she had replied. But people did. By the end of that month, her career was over. Early retirement, they called it, though she was only in her early 40s. She received a severance package, glowing letters about her years of service, and the cold realization that no one wanted her truth. Friends distanced themselves. Colleagues avoided her. The scandal never surfaced in the press. She was erased. Evelyn had retreated into smaller jobs, bookkeeping for small businesses, clerical work, anything that paid the bills without requiring her to fight battles she no longer had the strength to win. Each job paid less than the last. Each chipped away at the woman she had once been. By the time she ended up at the night market, tucked into a glass booth, she was too tired to resist the obscurity. She told herself she wanted it. Safety. Simplicity. But the truth was, invisibility hurt. Now, sitting at her kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee and an envelope of threats, Evelyn realized she couldn't hide anymore. She had seen too much. The patterns in the receipts, the man in the leather jacket, the young thief at her booth, they were pieces of the same puzzle. She closed her eyes and took a long sip of coffee. Fear coiled in her chest, but beneath it, another feeling grew. Anger. Determination. The same fire that had once driven her to stand in a boardroom full of men, twice her power, and refuse to bend. When evening came, she returned to the market. The lights glowed as bright as ever, music spilling from every corner, families filling the aisles. But to Evelyn, the air felt heavier. She kept her gaze sharp, scanning faces as she sold wristbands, noting every exchange, every gesture that seemed just a little too quick, a little too practiced. And then she saw it again. Near the food stalls, two men met briefly. One passed a small envelope to the other, so quickly most would have missed it. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. The envelope disappeared into a pocket, and the men walked away in opposite directions. She jotted the time and location in her notebook under the counter. Later that night, Kyle passed by her booth. His smile was tight, his steps nervous. Evelyn's gaze followed him as he moved to a vendor's stall. She saw the exchange, another envelope, another furtive glance. Her pulse quickened. Kyle wasn't just careless. He was part of it. The market closed at midnight. Evelyn locked her booth, her bag heavy with receipts, her notebook tucked close. She walked home slowly, her senses stretched thin. Each sound behind her made her glance over her shoulder. But she reached her apartment without incident. When she pushed open her door, she froze. The envelope from the night before no longer sat in the drawer where she had hidden it. It lay on the center of her table, opened, the contents spread neatly. The $20 bill, the photograph, the note. Her breath caught. Someone had been inside. She stumbled backward, her hand gripping the doorknob as if ready to bolt. The lock hadn't been broken. No windows shattered. But someone had been here, close enough to touch her life, to leave the threat where she couldn't ignore it. Her fear spiked, hot and sharp. But alongside it, her anger blazed brighter. They wanted her to back down, to fold, to keep quiet. But Evelyn Carter was done keeping quiet. She gathered the items back into the envelope, slid it into her notebook, and wrote across the page in firm, steady strokes. You tried to erase me once. Not again. The ghosts of her past had come roaring back. But this time, she wasn't running. This time, she was ready to fight. The night after finding the envelope spread across her table, Evelyn did not sleep at all. She sat in her chair with her back rigid, eyes fixed on the door as though it might open at any moment. The $20 bill lay in front of her like a curse. The note's 2 words burned into her thoughts. Keep quiet. The edges of the paper seemed to glow with menace in the lamplight, taunting her with its simplicity. By dawn, exhaustion had sunk into her bones, but her mind was sharper than it had been in years. Fear had long since transmuted into something else. Anger, yes, but also clarity. She had been erased once before, dismissed by men in expensive suits who pretended not to see the rot under their own floors. She would not be erased again. That morning, she brewed her coffee stronger than usual, black and biting. She sipped it slowly as she opened her notebook, flipping back to the page where she had scrawled her answer to their threat. No. The word anchored her. Every time her hand trembled, she looked at it again, as though drawing strength from the shape of her own defiance. By the time evening came and the market lights flickered alive, Evelyn had made her decision. She would set a trap. Not with words, not with confrontation, but with the only thing she trusted absolutely: numbers. The market buzzed with its usual chaos. Vendors barked out prices, music thumped from portable speakers, families drifted in with wide-eyed children. Evelyn sat behind her glass booth as though nothing had changed, though inside her chest, her heart hammered with purpose. Each time she handled a transaction, she made her movements more deliberate than ever. She placed the bills flat on the counter, counted slowly, announced the totals aloud. To the customers, it might have looked like the fussiness of an older woman unwilling to trust herself. But Evelyn wasn't performing for them. She was performing for the eyes she knew were on her. Sure enough, as the line ebbed and flowed, she saw him again. The man in the leather jacket leaned against a lamppost, half hidden in shadow, his gaze fixed unflinchingly on her booth. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, unblinking. He wasn't there for tickets. He wasn't there for food. He was there for her. For a moment, their eyes locked. His lips curled into that faint, knife-edged smile. Evelyn didn't look away. She forced her face into calm neutrality, sliding wristbands across the counter, smoothing bills into the drawer. Her defiance was subtle, but it was there. She would not give him the satisfaction of fear. When she finally looked up again, he was gone. Later that night, when the crowds had thinned and the music dulled, Evelyn made her move. She counted her drawer carefully, stacking the bills in neat piles. Then, deliberately, she removed one $10 bill and slipped it into her pocket. She noted the exact shortfall in her notebook. Cash drawer, 10 missing. If the next evening the drawer balanced again, she would know for certain. Someone was tampering with the records after she left. The market closed. Evelyn walked home slowly, every sound in the shadows making her heart twitch. The dark sedan did not appear, but she could feel its absence like a held breath. Her apartment was silent when she entered, but she checked every lock twice, every window latch, before finally sitting at her table. She wrote in her notebook for an hour, mapping connections, circling names, drawing arrows until the page looked like a web. She slept fitfully, her dreams filled with numbers that rearranged themselves into words. Keep quiet, keep quiet, keep quiet. The following evening, she arrived at the market early. The first thing she did, before selling a single ticket, was open her drawer. Her stomach dropped. The 10 was back. The drawer balanced perfectly, as though she had never touched it. Evelyn sat very still, staring at the neat stacks of bills. There was no mistake. She had written it down, hidden the bill in her pocket, checked the totals twice. Someone had tampered with the cash drawer after she had left the night before. Her suspicion was no longer suspicion. It was fact. She forced herself to continue her shift, her hands steady though her pulse thundered. She noted every irregularity she saw that night. An envelope passed between two men near the dumpling stall. Kyle, the assistant coordinator, lingering at booths longer than necessary, slipping papers into his jacket. Vendors glancing nervously over their shoulders as they handed him cash. By the time she returned home, her notebook was heavier with ink than ever before. She sat at her table until the small hours, staring at the mess of arrows and circles that sprawled across the pages. Every trail led back to the same place. Kyle. She thought of his dismissive smirk, his easy shrug, the way he had waved off her concerns. She thought of how quickly he had returned to his phone, uninterested in the evidence she had laid before him. It wasn't indifference. It was strategy. He hadn't wanted her to look because he knew what she would find. The realization hit her like a blow. He was in the middle of it. Her pen dug deep into the page as she wrote his name, circling it over and over. She whispered it aloud, her voice rough with exhaustion but steady with conviction. Kyle. The name filled the room. Her phone buzzed suddenly, startling her. She snatched it up. A message flashed across the screen. You're making a mistake. No name. No number she recognized. Her chest tightened. She typed back before she could stop herself. Who is this? No response. She stared at the screen until her vision blurred, then set the phone down slowly. They were watching closer than she thought, closer than she had allowed herself to believe. But instead of terror, what spread through her was resolve. She had proof now, enough to take to the police. Enough to drag this into the light. The next day, Evelyn walked into the local precinct with her canvas bag heavy at her side. She waited in the stale-smelling lobby until an officer approached, his expression curious but skeptical. She laid her notebook on the counter and began to explain. At first, his eyes glazed with the polite patience reserved for eccentric complaints. But as she flipped through page after page, showing him timestamps, altered receipts, the name Benson Logistics, his posture changed. His brow furrowed. He leaned closer. These are detailed, he admitted. I was a chief accountant for 20 years, Evelyn said. I know fraud when I see it. The officer nodded slowly. I'll pass this up the chain. But if you're right, you need to be careful. People don't like being exposed. Evelyn thought of the envelope on her table, of the man in the leather jacket, of the message on her phone. She met the officer's gaze and said, I already know. That evening, she returned to the market as always. The booth felt smaller than ever, the glass thinner, the crowd louder. But beneath her fear, her resolve burned steady. The trap had been set. The drawer had confirmed it. Kyle was in the center of the web. And soon, very soon, the spider would crawl into the open. The Brooklyn night market blazed brighter than usual that Saturday night. Word had spread of last week's commotion, of the ticket lady who caught the thief, and people came not just for the food and the lights, but for the chance to glimpse her. Evelyn Carter felt the shift the moment she arrived. Faces turned toward her booth with recognition. Strangers whispered, pointing. Some smiled, others simply looked curious, but no one ignored her anymore. It unsettled her. Visibility was dangerous. She had spent years learning how to be invisible, how to fade into the background where the world could not touch her. But tonight, under the glare of the market's lights and the weight of so many eyes, invisibility was gone. She straightened her shoulders as she unlocked her booth. If she was going to be seen, then she would control the narrative. The line formed quickly, bills sliding across the counter, wristbands exchanged. She moved with her usual precision, though her gaze flicked constantly to the crowd. She was watching for him, the man in the leather jacket. He had been absent for a few nights, but absence was not comfort. It was warning. Predators didn't vanish. They circled. And then she saw him, near the hot dog stand, leaning casually against the vendor's cart. His eyes found hers through the glass. He didn't smile this time. His face was blank, unreadable. That was worse. Her heart thudded once, hard, but she forced her hand steady as she handed a wristband to a teenager. She would not flinch. The night wore on. The crowd thickened. Evelyn noticed Kyle moving among the stalls, his posture tense, his smile forced. He lingered at booths, exchanging quick words with vendors, slipping envelopes into his jacket. She watched closely, her pen scribbling notes under the counter. At one stall, she saw the exchange too clearly to be mistaken. A vendor passed him an envelope thick with bills. Kyle tucked it into his jacket with a swift motion, his eyes darting nervously toward her booth. Her pulse quickened. This was it. Proof in plain sight. When Kyle passed near her booth, Evelyn stepped out from behind the glass. The crowd swirled around her, but her voice cut through. Kyle. He froze, startled to see her outside the booth. Miss Carter? You should be selling tickets. Her voice was low, sharp, carrying just enough to reach the people nearest them. I saw you. The envelopes. The money. You think no one notices? His face paled, but he forced a laugh. You're imagining things. No. Evelyn said louder now. I know laundering when I see it. You're skimming money from the vendors, feeding it through Benson Logistics, and covering the shortfalls in the drawers. The crowd slowed around them. People glanced over, sensing tension. A vendor stopped mid-shout. The air thickened with curiosity. Kyle leaned closer, his voice harsh. You don't know what you're talking about. Keep your mouth shut. Evelyn's eyes burned into his. I've kept quiet before. It ruined me. I won't make that mistake again. His jaw clenched. You have no proof. Her chin lifted. I have more proof than you think. As if on cue, sirens wailed. Blue and red lights splashed across the market entrance, flashing against the neon signs. The crowd shifted, murmuring, craning their necks. Police cars pulled up, doors opening, officers stepping out with steady strides. Evelyn's heart pounded. Detective Ramirez was among them, his gaze scanning the crowd until it landed on her. He approached quickly, flanked by two uniformed officers. Miss Carter, he called, loud enough for the vendors to hear. You said we'd find something tonight. Kyle stiffened. His hand twitched toward his jacket, where Evelyn knew the envelope lay. Ramirez's sharp eyes caught the motion. This him? Ramirez asked Evelyn. Her voice was steady. Yes. The officers moved. In an instant, Kyle was restrained, his protest spilling into the night air. This is a mistake. She's lying. She's just a ticket seller. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But Ramirez reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope. He cracked the flap and slid the bills free. The crowd gasped. Evidence secured, one officer said, lifting the stack for the others to see. The murmur swelled into a roar. Vendors shouted in disbelief. Some cursed, others cheered. The noodle vendor banged his ladle against his wok again, this time not in jest, but in triumph. Evelyn stood tall, her gray eyes unyielding as she faced Kyle. For years, men had dismissed her, silenced her, erased her. But tonight, in front of everyone, she had dragged the truth into the light. The man in the leather jacket appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face shadowed, his eyes locked on hers. For a moment, she thought he might move, might try to intervene. But then the sight of police officers, the crowd's anger, the flashing lights held him back. His lips twisted into a thin line before he turned and melted into the dark. Ramirez placed a hand on Evelyn's shoulder, steady and firm. You did good, he said. We've been hearing whispers about this for months, but no one had the evidence to pin it down. Your notes, they'll hold up in court. Her chest loosened, breath finally coming easier. I just followed the money, she murmured. He smiled faintly. That's more than most people would have done. The officers led Kyle away in handcuffs, his protests drowned by the cheers of the crowd. Reporters had already begun arriving, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Vendors pressed in around Evelyn, thanking her, some hugging her, others offering food as tokens of gratitude. She stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed but steady. For years, she had been invisible. Tonight, she was anything but. And yet, even as the celebration swelled, Evelyn knew this was only the beginning. Kyle was one thread, but Benson Logistics was a web that stretched far beyond the market. The man in the leather jacket was still out there. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of vindication. For the first time in 15 years, she was not dismissed, not silenced. She was heard. She was Evelyn Carter, and she had pulled the truth into the open. The market looked different the night after Kyle's arrest. The lights were the same, strings of bulbs crisscrossing the aisles, neon signs buzzing with color. The smells were the same too, churros frying in oil, corn roasting on open flames, garlic sizzling in woks. But the atmosphere had shifted. The Brooklyn night market, so often just a place of noise and food and fleeting joy, now buzzed with something heavier, something brighter. Evelyn felt it the moment she stepped under the painted arch, heads turned toward her booth. Strangers whispered, pointing. A group of teenagers waved, grinning. Vendors called her name in passing, their smiles warm, their eyes alight with gratitude. For years, she had lived as if she were invisible, fading into the background, unnoticed except for the briefest exchanges at her ticket window. Tonight, she was anything but invisible. Tonight, everyone saw her. She unlocked her booth slowly, her hands steady even as her chest fluttered. It was strange, this sudden recognition, this shift in how the world looked at her. It unsettled her, but it also warmed her. The attention was not the shallow kind she had seen in boardrooms, not the calculated respect of men who shook hands in glass towers. This was something different. It was gratitude. As the line began to form, she moved with her usual precision, counting bills, smoothing them flat, announcing totals aloud. But tonight, every wristband she handed over came with a thank you. Parents told their children, "That's her, the woman who caught the thief." A vendor pressed a free cup of coffee into her hands, murmuring, "For everything you did." Even the teenagers who usually snickered at her serious expression looked at her with admiration, as though she had become part of some story they would tell their friends. She wanted to shrug it off, to remind them she was just doing what she always did, following the money. But she didn't. Instead, she allowed herself to absorb it, to let their gratitude soak into the cracks of the silence she had lived with for years. Later that evening, Detective Ramirez returned. His badge glinted under the market lights, his expression softer than it had been when they first met. He walked up to her booth, hands in his pockets, and smiled. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I wanted you to hear it from me. The DA's office is moving forward. Kyle's facing fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy charges. And thanks to the connections in your notes, we've got federal investigators looking into Benson Logistics. This isn't just a local case anymore." Evelyn's throat tightened. "So it won't just disappear?" she asked, the question heavier than he could know. Ramirez shook his head. "Not this time. You made sure of that." She swallowed hard, nodding. A strange ache filled her chest. Not pain, but something close to release. For years, she had carried the weight of knowing she had been right once before, of being silenced for it, erased. Now, finally, the truth had a voice, and it was hers. But even as relief washed over her, she thought of the man in the leather jacket. He hadn't been caught. He hadn't even been questioned, as far as she knew. He was out there still, watching, waiting. And she knew that Kyle, for all his arrogance, had not been the mastermind. He was a pawn. The web stretched farther, wider, deeper. Ramirez seemed to read her thoughts. "It's not over," he said quietly. "But it's a start. And you gave us that start." The words stayed with her long after he left. The following weekend, the market's organizers held a small gathering near the entrance arch. It wasn't official, not formal, just something the community had put together. Vendors brought food. Children carried handmade signs that said things like, "Thank you, Miss Evelyn," in messy marker. Someone had bought flowers from a corner store, a bright bouquet of daisies and carnations, which they pressed into her hands as she stood, bewildered, at the center of the crowd. "You saved us," said the noodle vendor, his voice thick. "We didn't know where the money was going. We thought it was just the cost of doing business. But you gave us back our dignity." Evelyn's eyes burned, but she held herself straight. She wasn't used to speeches, wasn't used to being thanked. For so long, her work had been invisible, her efforts buried, her truth unwanted. To stand here now, surrounded by faces full of gratitude, felt almost surreal. Detective Ramirez stepped forward, raising his voice so it carried. Not all heroes wear badges or sit in offices. Sometimes they sit in booths, counting bills, paying attention when no one else does. Evelyn Carter saw what no one else was willing to see, and she refused to stay silent. Applause erupted. Whistles cut through the air. Someone shouted, "3 cheers for Evelyn," and the crowd responded with laughter and joy. She stood there, clutching the bouquet, cheeks flushed, her gray eyes glistening. For once, she didn't shrink from the attention. She allowed herself to feel it, to let the moment wash over her. That night, when the market returned to its usual rhythm, Evelyn sat behind her booth with the bouquet resting beside the cash drawer. She looked at the flowers, their colors vivid against the dull gray counter, and let out a quiet laugh. She thought of her younger self, the woman in a blazer standing in a boardroom, pointing to charts, certain that truth would prevail. That woman had been silenced, dismissed, erased. But here, in this noisy, chaotic market, Evelyn Carter had found her redemption. She wasn't just the ticket lady. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't ordinary. She was the woman who had dragged corruption into the light. And though she knew the fight wasn't finished, the man in the leather jacket still out there, Benson Logistics still a shadow looming larger than Kyle. The fear no longer owned her. She carried her notebook not as a shield, but as a banner, proof that even in small places, truth mattered. When she walked home that night, the streets felt different. The shadows no longer pressed so close. The air no longer carried the weight of threat. She looked up at the city's skyline, its towers glowing against the night, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel small. At her apartment door, she paused. The thought of her daughter surfaced, her face bright, her voice soft, her life separate but connected. Evelyn knew she would tell her everything soon. She wanted her to know that her mother wasn't just surviving quietly, but standing tall again. She stepped inside, set the bouquet on the table, and opened her notebook. On the last page, beneath the word no, she wrote, "The work isn't finished, but neither am I." She closed the book, exhaled slowly, and allowed herself, for the first time in many years, to feel peace. Evelyn Carter had been underestimated, dismissed, silenced. But not anymore. She had been right all along. And this time, no one could erase her.